under the guise of you need look no further than these examples.
That's right. They say that part of the fact that a lot of this was out in the public means that it might not accumulate to be an obstruction count as it would in a different place. Because
hey guys,
when he's out there, so that's why he may have been so dogmatic about continuing over and over again to go against.
Sorry guys, the game's still downloading.
And to try to tear down everything that happened. But it's clear from reading this that the president was extremely upset with each turn of the investigation, and he did make efforts to get his own staff to lie about the investigation and what he was doing to shut it down.
Thank you, Julia. Just flag us. We'll come right back to you. Ari Melber, how is that different from me proclaiming publicly, I hate you, I'm going to kill you? Does that make it less of a murder when I do it?
Well, the argument we heard from Barr, the president's lawyers, is that it was less illicit or corrupt because it was all just fuming, venting, etc. I think it's a weak legal argument. What I would add in looking at what we're learning here, because I'm holding copies of the report, and for viewers, I don't yet know the range of the redactions, but I think it's worth showing folks as America comes to understand what we're seeing. There's
probably that thing that says America.
I'm working off of a black and white edition.
Did it say America on your phone?
And there are other pages.
I mean, United States.
Meaning only in the footnotes. So as we go through this today live, we're going to be able to walk through what that means.
Those two pages, what does it seem the redactions are for? Can you tell? Is it?
Yeah, so great question. Great question. They are very specifically labeled. So here we have a black redaction in red. It's labeled grand jury. that's the lawful stuff. That is the strongest legal argument to redact.
High speed,
and then I've got
light
a
speed,
footnote
and quantum
952 that says investigative technique in yellow. And that's saying in the footnote they want to basically hold back that information so as not to reveal how they got it, the investigative technique in plain English. The other point I want to make as we're understanding everything is we are learning here as we read this report together what they went through in looking at the potential election conspiracy. And so it's very interesting to give a summary. I think we're going to get into details later. Okay. But at a summary level, Brian, I'm going to read now from the Mueller report. Headline, Papadopoulos learns Russia has, quote, dirt in Clinton emails. Headline, Russia-related communications. Headline, Trump campaigns knowledge of, quote, dirt. So what we're seeing there, what we're going to report out for over time is Bob Mueller's investigative narrative of these events. You have covered, and many watching at home may remember all the discussion of whether or not there was a quid pro quo to help Putin at the Republican National Convention. I can tell you the Mueller report has a headline, Events at the Republican National Convention. Quote, Ambassador Kislyak's encounters with Senator Sessions and J.D. Gordon the week of the RNC, and then a multi-page discussion of the change to the Republican Party platform. So what we're going to see very clearly here as we go through this, Brian, is the difference between things that were rumored or discussed and the things that Mueller sought to both investigate and detail.
And we'll go back to
I gotta meet with my friend, and
he have Russians walking around Cleveland, Ohio.
And if I don't meet with him by like now.
Then Matt Miller.
One of the big questions we've had all along is what happened? Why didn't Mueller interview the president? He answers it in the obstruction report. It says we sought a voluntary interview with the president. After more than a year of discussion, the president declined to be interviewed. There's a redacted chunk. It says grand jury was the reason for redacting. During the course of our discussion, they continue, the president did agree to answer written questions on certain Russia-related topics, and he provided us with answers. He did not similarly agree to provide written answers on questions of obstruction. Julia Ainsley, are you still with us? Is that come close to offering one of the explanations for why Mueller didn't render an opinion on obstruction? Do you know what the answer is for why Mueller came to his conclusion on obstruction?
He goes through many different details of this. A lot of them seem to be relying on the fact that this wasn't a normal person they were investigating. They say that because he was president, it makes sense that he was using his Article II powers that a president has that others of us do not have. like the power to fire your FBI director. They also point out that he was very worried about his political career and his presidency, and so some of that angst may have been factoring in. They also do talk about intent. Now, they don't say that that another crime, an underlying crime, has to prove intent, but they do say the fact that there wasn't an underlying crime is one of the factors that they investigated. I'd also like to go through the 10 things that they investigated, the key issues of obstruction, if I could.
Please do.
Okay, the first here, the campaign's response to reports about Russian support for Trump. Conduct involving the FBI Director Comey and Michael Flynn. The president's reaction to the continuing Russia investigation. The president's termination of James Comey, the appointment of the special counsel and efforts to remove him, which from reading this I have found the most interesting so far.
He's from Minecraft.
Efforts to curtail the special counsel's investigation. This is like digging up dirt on him and his potential conflicts of interest. Efforts to prevent public disclosure of evidence. Further efforts to have the Attorney General take control of the investigation. That will be the pressure on Jeff Sessions. Efforts to have Don McGahn, the White House counsel, deny that the president had ordered him to have the special counsel removed, as I previously detailed. And conduct towards Michael Flynn and Paul Manafort. I will say some of that was redacted because it could harm an ongoing matter, which could be the further sentencing of Michael Flynn. And then also the conduct involving Michael Cohen. One piece on Michael Cohen I need to dive into some more, but they explained that Michael Cohen was someone who was mistold about these Moscow tapes, and that in fact he had been lied to about the contents of them. So lots to dig into here, but Nicole, you're asking the right questions because they lay out this legal analysis. They get into whether or not the president had to have corrupt intent and know what he was doing. But in the end, it does appear to come down to that jump ball. And that sentence that we saw in the bottom line conclusions jumped out to me again today. This does not exonerate the president on the issue of obstruction. Another thing I'll point out is just the volume here. I mean, this is obstruction, much thicker than what we have here on collusion. It's a much thinner thing. They did the amount of information I have here on obstruction is far larger.
Julia, I'm stunned by this language here about the inconclusiveness, and this would show the limits and how hindered they were by not having an interview with the president. They were not able to reach a conclusion about whether Donald Trump knew about Mike Flynn's conversations with Ambassador Kislyak, which in some ways was the
part of
the original sin. So I think this is a pull from the reports, from Mueller's report. Some evidence suggests that the president knew about the existence and content of Flynn's calls when they occurred. But the evidence is inconclusive and could not be relied upon to establish the president's knowledge. In advance of Flynn's initial call with Kislyak, the president attended a meeting where the sanctions were discussed. They told so many lies about that it's stunning that it goes down to why they could not exonerate him. They could not clear him of what really was one of the original sins of the entire web of lies told by the most senior White House advisors at this time, or transition officials, vis-a-vis contacts with Russians.
That's right, Nicole. And they also detail how the president told KT McFarland, who you can remember was on the transition and in the beginning parts of the White House, where she was a national security advisor, talked to Michael Flynn ahead of those Kislyak conversations. The president asked KT McFarland to deny those conversations. She then took a note of it. They say that it wasn't wrong of him to talk to her about that, but she took a note of it because she knew that the request was so strange. But this part about him not sitting down for an interview, though this was really interesting. They say that after a year of pressing the president and his legal team to sit down for an interview, they eventually had to decide that the written answers and his public comments and everything that was out in the open had to be enough to suffice that. But I think you have to go back to the fact that they're looking at the OLC opinion that says you can't indict a sitting president, so therefore can you subpoena one and force one to sit down for an interview or for grand jury testimony? I think that's what really hinges all of this, that the obstruction question was handled differently because we're talking about the President of the United States.
To our viewers, just a computer matter, you will see pages with this much redaction, as I just came across page 20. Also, so far, this appears to be non-searchable, which is very non-2019 of them and will hamper us doing our job.
I'm not surprised that the department rarely puts things out in form that are searchable, so I doubt that it's intentional in this reason. It's just that they're behind the times in terms of technology. Nicole's been going through the obstruction section. I've been trying to get through the Russian collusion section, and already I'm noticing that the special counsel deliberately does not make the point that the Attorney General said today. The Attorney General came out and said today that we now know the Russian operatives who perpetrated these schemes did not have the cooperation of President Trump or his campaign. That is not what the special counsel says. He goes through the charging decisions they made, and then when going through each one says there's not enough evidence about the Trump Tower meeting or the WikiLeaks hacks to charge a violation of anyone from the Trump campaign. And then I think quite tellingly, you notice that you mentioned how in the obstruction piece of the inquiry they didn't have enough information, partly because they couldn't interview the president. It notes that further, the office learned that some of the individuals interviewed or whose conduct we investigated, including some associated with the Trump campaign, deleted relevant communications or communicated during the relevant period using applications that feature encryption or do not provide long-term retention. Accordingly, while this report embodies factual and legal determinations that the office believes to be accurate and complete to the greatest extent possible, given these identified gaps, the office cannot rule out the possibility that the available information would shed additional light on the events described in the report. They are making very clear that people lied to them, people deleted evidence, people used encrypted applications, so there is no way we can clear the president because we can't get all the information that would be available to do so.
So much for the Presidential Records Act. This is why future presidential museums may have not a shred of paper in them.
Yeah, and if it's searchable, like you're saying, it won't necessarily be a bad thing. Look, it's a stunning sweep of conduct that is, again, we warned at the beginning that we'd be staring at trees, not the forest. The forest is the swampiest mess of misconduct you could imagine. I mean, they couldn't determine what Donald Trump knew about conversations between his incoming national security advisor and the Russian ambassador that he lied about, that he protected so fiercely. He lied to the FBI about it and he's now a felon. I mean, that they couldn't get at the heart of some of the questions they were trying to answer because they were dealing with what Chris Christie called liars who lie, and what other detractors might question to be more sinister motives around all the lies. Is just a stunning place for this to rest, and it really does begin to reveal, and we haven't gone through it, but it begins to reveal the delta between the actual substance of the Mueller investigation and what Barr did today. It also explains the reporting a couple weeks ago from the New York Times and the Washington Post about Mueller's investigators being unhappy with Barr's presentation. You look at this for 2 minutes and it's abundantly clear why they would be.
Ari Melber's been looking at it. Ari, you just came across a critical portion that we've been quoting in advance.
That's correct. This is a part of our group effort here. We've all been studying these quotes from the Mueller report. We are now for the first time reading quotes in context, and this is a quote that will be partially recognizable to viewers because Mr. Barr quoted part of it. Let me read it now in its full context, the obstruction discussion section of the Mueller report. It states, if we had confidence after a thorough investigation of the facts that the president clearly did not commit obstruction of justice, we would so state. Based on the facts and the applicable legal standards, we are unable to reach that judgment. As a top-line level, I will tell you, this is similar to what Barr referred to. It states and shows that the Mueller prosecutors did this investigation and did not ultimately land on saying there was obstruction by President Trump, nor did the evidence they find clear President Trump. And they, for reasons we're going to continue to report out in this live coverage, they decided to detail all of the facts and incidents and the information that they've gleaned and corroborated and leave it there, so to speak, for whatever further process America or the political system deals with, rather than reach what, again, Brian, what the Mueller folks call, quote, a traditional prosecutorial judgment, which, again, we don't usually reach about a sitting president.
Julia Ainsley, standing by outside DOJ. Julia, go ahead.
Well, two other things I want to point out about how Mueller made his decision, or lack thereof, on obstruction. I mentioned that they consulted that Office of Legal Counsel opinion that says you can't indict a sitting president. But he even goes on to say, and apart from the Office of Legal Counsel's view, we recognize that a federal criminal accusation against a sitting president would place burdens on the president's capacity to govern and potentially preempt constitutional process for addressing presidential misconduct. So in other words, the fact he's the president is a factor here. There's another thing where they come down to their bottom line conclusions on obstruction, and I think this is really key here. It said, before we determined not to make a traditional prosecutorial judgment, we did not draw ultimate conclusions about the president's conduct. The evidence we obtained about the president's actions and intent presents difficult issues that would need to be resolved if we were making a traditional prosecutorial judgment. So that begs the question to me, how do these need to be resolved? They need the Attorney General and the Justice Department to resolve these issues, to figure out whether or not they could move forward with a charge on obstruction. Who left these unresolved? Is it our Office of Legal Counsel's opinions just aren't dated up to this point? Is it that the law doesn't allow him to? Or is it that there were conversations where he felt that he could not move forward based on the fact that he couldn't get permission to go forward with these charges on a sitting president?
Julia, thank you. Ari, this calls for opinion. Are people going to come away from this document and this coverage today with the logical question, what else did you need? Are they pinning too much on the fact that they weren't able to sit down with this president, knowing this president and what that oral interview might have been like?
I think
do you get what I mean?
I get exactly what you mean. The oral interview with a president who's already told Lester Holt that he did it with Russia on his mind,
right,
may have already revealed so much. I think what we're seeing, as Julia mentioned, is it was very clear that Bob Mueller, a traditionalist, an institutionalist, and one who cares deeply about the rules, more so than whatever other scalps a prosecutor might want to get, so to speak. I think Bob Mueller looked at this and very clearly said, we take the investigation of the sitting president seriously, and while there's been a lot of back and forth about what it means that you can't indict a sitting president under the rules of the DOJ, under administrations of both parties, it would appear that that hung in the background. And so I think what we're seeing here and what we're going to be reporting on throughout the day, Brian, is something much more similar to the Watergate roadmap. A lot of evidence, material, and facts for the country and the Congress to deal with or look at and move on from, rather than Bob Mueller anointing himself someone who was going to jam the Attorney General and say, you better indict a sitting president, or you better do more than this. I don't think Mueller looked at that as part of his brief with the evidence he had.
All right, Frank Figliuzzi, what have you found?
So as we begin to process this report, we're not only learning about our president, but we're learning even more about our Attorney General as a disingenuous broker of information. Brian, in his initial summary to us, don't forget, the Attorney General said, look, we came at this regardless of the premise that can't, that this is the President of the United States, that you can't indict a sitting president. We chose not to look at it that way. But we're learning through this report that indeed it appears that was hanging in the balance, that was a factor that weighed heavily on Mueller. And so when we have the Attorney General saying, no, wasn't a factor, we took this as just kind of your average Joe, and now Mueller seeming to say in the report, look, this was an issue even governing whether I could subpoena or sit down with him for an in-person interview. We've got a disconnect, and it goes right to the heart of whether this should go to Congress or not to decide. And it's looking more and more like Mueller was at least implying this is for the Congress to decide. I'm constrained here, and we've got an Attorney General who's not an honest broker of information to the public.
Just to our viewers, here is what has been deposited on my desk. I can't wait to see if it follows any order. Nicole Wallace has had the luxury of at least 2 minutes worth of reading.
Well, we here just organically divided and conquered, and I've been going through the obstruction content, and it's stunning. If the headline of even the highly selective, highly edited bar letter was "do not exonerate," here's the full context of that, as Julia's been reporting.
Please. The
full "do not exonerate" quote, because we determined not to make a traditional prosecutorial judgment, we did not draw ultimate conclusions about the president's conduct. The evidence we obtained about the president's actions and intent presents difficult issues that would need to be resolved if we were making a traditional prosecutorial judgment. At the same time, if we had confidence, after a thorough investigation of the facts, that the president clearly did not commit obstruction of justice, we would so state. So the special counsel is saying, if we could have proven in 22 months that he didn't obstruct justice, that he didn't commit a crime, we would say so. back to the text, based on the facts and the applicable legal standards, we are unable to reach that judgment. Accordingly, while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. It's a window into just how shaded the Attorney General's summary was on that one line. All he put in there was does not exonerate. What the special counsel is saying is we spent 22 months and we would have if we could have.
It's like he had a searchable version and he put in find me something good.
I'm back at the question of why. Why didn't Barr just let this speak for itself? They weren't going to indict
I think
him.
you know the answer.
Well, I think it's
parents would
becoming
say.
alarmingly clear. And I think that anyone was lulled into any sort of comfort that we would simply have a continuation of the Sessions-run DOJ or the Rosenstein-run DOJ while Sessions was recused, or even the Whitaker period was sadly mistaken. The Barr influence on this what was spun out of the final conclusion is so different and so distinct from what's in here just on that one phrase, do not exonerate. They didn't exonerate him because the evidence didn't suggest he should be exonerated.
Joyce Vance is standing by. Joyce, I have two questions for you. Number one, have you found any evidence that in the wording that this was brought to a premature close, that anything about this was organically meant to go farther than it did? A. B, what about those summaries that Mueller had prepared thinking they could go straight to the public? Are they in here and are they okay?
So I'm the slow reader in the group, Brian, and I have not made it through all 300 plus pages. And so I think we don't know yet, or at least I don't know if there's reason to believe that Mueller was stopped before he was ready to stop the investigation. No indication of that so far. But one thing that's very clear is that these executive summaries that were prepared to caption each section of the investigation, that those summaries could have been released the same day that Bill Barr saw this report for the first time. There is really no explanation for the 3-week holdup, other than, as Nicole says, the forest looks pretty swampy here. And it looks like there was an effort to buy a little bit more time, to pull out some of the most favorable aspects of the full report, and to present those first, in hopes that what would stick in people's minds would be those sort of bumper sticker positive conclusions, rather than the more complete nature of the evidence here, which in many ways is very damaging. Mueller goes through his prosecutive decisions in detail, outlining statutes, in some cases explaining why there were technical reasons that an indictment shouldn't be available. And I think at the end this looks so much, as someone else has said, like the roadmap that the Watergate provided to Congress, so that Congress could make a decision about whether or not there was conduct, even if not technically a federal crime, that rose to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors. We are talking here about a president abusing his office and failing to take care to fully perform consistent with the laws.
So, Joyce, this does call for a judgment from you. To what end, when the history of the Barr era at the Justice Department is written, and we're helping to write a chapter of that in real time now today, to what end, why this maniacal search for the best possible sentences, paragraphs, syllables? Why say out loud at the start of this day at least 4 times, no collusion?
You know, that's the question that everyone who has worked in the Justice Department and who loves the institution, that's the question we are all searching for an answer to this morning, because the Attorney General is not the President's lawyer, and yet this Attorney General has continued to act as though he represents the President of the United States.
No, he's my friend.
The answer to that question, I think, will be the legacy of his tenure at Justice, and it won't be positive.
Nicole Wallace.
I'm just going through the President's interactions with his national security officials, and they're just stunning. I mean, it's hard reading this and reading the evidence and reading the footnotes to think of what the president did other than obstruct justice in the first 22 months.
Why is the light there?
Hours and hours of hours engaged in what the report describes in each section under each act as obstructive conduct. So this is his conduct. These were his interactions. And it goes to what Jeremy Bash has been saying for months now. The questions about his state of mind, and Frank Figliuzzi's talked about this too, vis-a-vis Russia. only become sharper and more urgent after this. So this is from the report. On Saturday, March 25th, 2017, 3 days after meeting in the Oval Office, the president called Coates, his DNI, and again complained about the Russia investigation, saying words to the effect of, I can't do anything with Russia. There's things I'd like to do with Russia, with trade, with ISIS, and they're all over me with this. Coates told the president that the investigations were going to go on. The best thing to do is to let them run their course. Coates later testified in a congressional hearing they never felt pressure to intervene or interfere in any way or was shaping intelligence in a political way or in a relationship. It goes on and on. It goes through his contacts with Michael Rogers, his contacts with Pompeo. I mean, he wanted his entire national security apparatus to clear him from the Russia investigation. The investigation was into this central question of what General Hayden described as a political 9/11. He didn't want to get to the bottom of Russian interference in our democracy because he wanted to, in his own words, do things with Russia. There's things I'd like to do with Russia, and we're just back at that.
Why are you looking like that?
This isn't about the rigor of protecting our government and democracy. Just a heads up to folks at home. This is part one. If you're going to try printing this yourself, be ready. In terms of toner and paper, part one.
No.
We're doing the same thing. We are making a searchable version, however, here. Jeremy Bash, you've been reading along with us.
The first 200 pages, basically an avalanche of narrative about the Russian efforts to influence the election on behalf of Donald Trump. And this covers every conceivable topic under the sun, from the Trump Tower meeting to actually the Trump Tower Moscow project, to the meeting in the Seychelles with Eric Prince, to everything we've been reading bits and pieces about, but this weaves together a narrative. And I think it's interesting that on page 181 of the report, Bob Mueller explicitly states that the word collusion is not the right word to use, although that's in fact the word that the president's been using over and over again, and his attorney general hummed it like a chorus in a Trump theme song this morning. The special counsel on page 181 says that collusion is not a legal term, and we're really analyzing whether or not American individuals violate particular laws, campaign finance laws, foreign agent registration laws, etc. And it in fact states that the Trump campaign did work with WikiLeaks on multiple planes and efforts to disseminate information that would support its campaign, yet of course publishing information is not per se a campaign finance violation if you do not participate in the underlying hacking. So I think there's a lot of material to go through here, and I don't think in any way it supports the way Bill Barr tried to front-end the report this morning, tried to spin it for the president, issue his pre-buttal. The report speaks for itself.
Julia Ainsley, I'm told, is waving at our camera. Justice, Julia, go ahead.
I think this is fascinating and really contradicts what the Attorney General
Shut
told us this
up.
morning about the fact that he is the ultimate authority and not Congress. Mueller laid out a different case. He says on page 382 that under the Office of Legal Counsel's analysis, Congress can permissibly criminalize certain obstructive conduct by the president, such as subverting perjury, intimidating witnesses, or fabricating evidence, because those prohibitions raise no separation of powers question. The Constitution does not authorize the president to engage in such conduct, and those actions would transgress the president's duty to take care of the laws that can be faithfully executed. This is a second time, I've also seen on page 381, that the special counsel says that this is okay if Congress wants to take up this question. That under his statute as a special counsel and under the Office of Legal Counsel opinion, he didn't think that he could make a determination on whether or not to criminally charge the president on obstruction, but he says that the actions are still something that Congress can look over and that Congress can decide whether or not it is criminal conduct. In other words, perhaps there's enough evidence here to start impeachment proceedings. That is something that this Justice Department and this Attorney General have been waving us off of completely, and the Attorney General was very emphatic about that this morning when he said, I am responsible for this report, not Congress and not Robert Mueller. He reports to me.
To Nicole Wallace and then Ari Melber.
And the report is just laced with Mueller's report in their own language, underscoring the point Julia just made. This is from the beginning of the obstruction section, where A lot of people said look for their articulation of why they neither recommended prosecution and why they refused to issue a declination letter. This is their fourth explanation. If we had confidence after a thorough investigation of the facts that the president clearly did not commit obstruction of justice, we would so state. Based on the facts and the applicable legal standards, we are unable to reach that judgment. The evidence we obtained about the president's actions and intent presents difficult issues that prevent us from conclusively determining that no criminal conduct occurred. Accordingly, while this report does not conclude he committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. So well, it means that
get away from me.
They didn't investigate this and decide, as in we use the Hillary example, that no crime had been. Trump didn't reach the level Hillary did. They investigated Hillary's use of a personal email and said no criminal conduct here, and then Comey went out in a very uncelebrated press event and shared all of the investigative results. Trump didn't even get that far. They didn't come out and say no criminal obstruction occurred. They stopped short of that, and they released all the evidence. It almost guarantees that Congress will do what they need to do to obtain all the underlying evidence. And there's a lot in here, especially on the obstruction side. But the fact that Mueller says we cannot conclude that no crimes occurred around obstruction really
Hello?
leaves this wide open.
I would say
Hello?
some of the evidence was related to obstruction. You can see why they couldn't exonerate the president because the evidence is quite damning. I'm looking at the section of Michael Cohen here. The report says that Cohen recalled that the president's personal counsel, which I think at the time this is written, told him he would be protected so long as he didn't go rogue. Privately, this before Michael Cohen cooperated, the president told Cohen to hang in there and stay strong. People who were close to the Cohen and the president passed messages to Cohen that the president loves you, the boss loves you, everyone knows the boss has your back. After Cohen flipped, however, the president began to attack him publicly, and the report states the evidence concerning the sequence of events could support an inference the president used inducements in the form of positive messages in an effort to get Cohen not to cooperate, and then turn to attacks and intimidation to deter the provision of information or undermine his cooperation once he did. It further goes into there's this BuzzFeed report that was to some extent knocked down the special counsel about whether the special counsel had evidence that the president had told Cohen to lie to Congress. It doesn't go as far as saying that, but it goes through the relevant facts and says the evidence could support an inference that the president was aware of these facts at the time of Cohen's false statements to Congress. So it doesn't say the president told him to lie, but the president knew he was lying when he made those false statements to Congress. Some of the evidence, just in this section alone, is incredibly damning about the president's behavior.
It also suggests he could have been a target the whole time of the obstruction probe, which is why he refused to ever answer any questions. It suggests that the Justice Department may have viewed him as a subject of the conspiracy with Russia and a target of the obstruction probe, which was why he never, ever was going to answer any questions about obstruction.
Ari Melber has been doing a deep dive on the portion of this that deals with the Trump Tower meeting. And again, as a veteran lawmaker said to me months ago, any meeting you're having during the course of a presidential campaign that requires a Russian translator, stop and ask yourself if you're doing the right thing.
I think that's well put, Brian. We've been digging into this as we promised to look at the facts, not the bar depictions. And I want to go into 2 points here. One is potentially bad news for Mr. Barr, and one is good news for Donald Trump Jr. What we see here is the way the Trump Tower meeting with Russians offering assistance was investigated and was ultimately legally analyzed. And I want to give the headline first, which is the good news for Donald Trump Jr. The Mueller report saying, taking into account the high burden, I'm reading, the high burden to establish the mental state in what they looked at this as a potential campaign finance prosecution, and the difficulty, they say, of the valuation, which I'll explain in a moment. Mueller writes, quote, we decided not to pursue criminal campaign finance charges against Donald Trump Jr. or other campaign officials for the events culminating in the June 9th meeting. Why that is important is it tells us how they looked at this issue. They looked at it as a potential crime violating U.S. campaign finance law if you knowingly solicit and then get something of value from a foreigner. And what they found, to put it in plain English, is that Donald Trump Jr. and apparently these unnamed or general reference to other campaign officials we know who was at the meeting didn't have the knowledge to support the high bar of a criminal charge, and that the office wasn't sure that they would be able to value that so-called, quote, dirt. If you say it is what it is, I love it. That dirt wouldn't be able to value it high enough for the charge. That's good news for Donald Trump Jr. The other piece of reporting I want to share, Brian, is potentially bad news for Mr. Barr. It is the fact that, as your reporters and our legal experts have noted, Mr. Barr and Mr. Mueller today have now broken with each other on what was under investigation. Mr. Barr using Donald Trump's Twitter speak to repeatedly intone with the authority of the Justice Department at that press conference, quote, no collusion. And that we now know, Mr. Barr said, with the knowledge of and breaking with what's in this Mueller report, that says very explicitly they didn't look at this in a, quote, collusion standard, which is only legally comes up rarely in antitrust law, but looked at it as a conspiracy standard. I think that's significant. Why did Mr. Barr feel the need to go that far? And the final thing I want to share from my read, and I'll come back to you as I think I have interesting things, is something that sounds bad, I think, for the actual people interviewed in the Trump campaign. And that is a statement here in the Mueller report that several Trump officials or people affiliated with the campaign continue to lie to the special counsel's office, including about Russia-related matters. That may sound obvious, but it's different when we talk about it in public and when Mueller says that's part of understanding this probe, its length and its intensity, Brian. The special counsel reporting in the report today that their investigation was, quote, materially impacted by those repeated lies. And so this goes back, I can read, the investigation established several individuals affiliated with the Trump campaign lied to the office and to the Congress about their interactions with Russian-affiliated individuals in related matters. Those lies materially, you see it right here, those lies materially impair the investigation of Russian election interference. As you know from covering this, Brian, it's one thing to say somebody made a mistake or a single lie. Material impact, as Bob Mueller saying, part of the reason this went down this way and took so long is they kept lying to me about Russia. Now, he's not charging a Russia conspiracy, which again gets us back to the mystery. Why so many lies? That's an important thing that Mueller wants the Congress and now the public to know.
And if you're a Democrat in Congress, you're thinking we have the remedy for that. We'll call these people in front of us and see if they're willing to lie under oath on live television. Frank Figliuzzi has been reading a portion of this, and I think, Frank, the lead-up is two guys walk into a cigar bar in New York, one a Russian, one an American. Take it from there.
Yeah, so I'm on page 140, and again, I'm keenly interested in the Russian counterintelligence aspects of this. And here's what the continuing theme of Attorney General Barr this morning and in the past, not being an honest broker of information to the U.S. people. He told us this morning that he had no evidence of Americans, any Americans, engaged in the Russian efforts to meddle with the campaign. Yet on page 140, it says here, Manafort briefed Kilimnik. Now remember who Kilimnik is. He is someone with known or suspected ties to Russian intelligence. Manafort briefed Kilimnik on the state of the Trump campaign and Manafort's plan to win the election. That briefing encompassed the campaign's messaging and its internal polling data. According to Gates, it also included discussion of, quote, battleground states, which Manafort identified as Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota.
Wow.
Now, look, if you're handing internal strategy and polling data to a Russian intelligence-affiliated individual and you're naming the battleground states, what do you intend for that? For them to do with that information other than to help you and do something to aid the campaign. So when Attorney General says absolutely no evidence of Americans aiding, abetting, engaged with Russia, meddling with us, it does not ring true by what I'm seeing here in the report.
Frank Figliuzzi, there's a through line. When you read all of the accounts in Bob Woodward's book and Jim Comey's book about that meeting between the heads of America's intelligence agencies during the transition, when they all flew up to New York to go visit Donald Trump, Jim Comey described it as a meeting with akin to meeting with Cosa Nostra mob family. They sat around, they asked not one question about what the Russians did to meddle in our election, and their interest even then in the transition was around making sure that not a single thing that came out about the Russian effort, the Russian operation, made it look like his win was illegitimate. that seems to run through how he governed as president. He remained completely disinterested in this Russian attack on the American democracy.
Get off me. Get off me.
By almost an insatiable desire to prove that he won all by himself like a big boy, that he didn't ever want to understand what the Russians did. Is there anything in here that would just sort of hit this administration side of the head with a 2x4 and make abundantly clear that the Russian effort was so clear, so obvious, so deliberate, and that it is, as you said, so targeted that it has to be dealt with before another election comes around?
Yeah, I think that's the theme that I'm picking up on the so-called collusion portion of the report, is that we've got the repeated overtures and by the Russian government and receptivity on the part of Trump's people, and the detailed accounting, Nicole, and the impressive work of the FBI and intelligence community to ferret out how the GRU did this, how the GRU implanted their malware in the DNC and extracted this, and then all of the receptivity of those around this president. And then I just can't stop emphasizing enough, because it's just disturbing, our attorney general mischaracterizing the findings here, that simply there was no collusion. It simply is not ringing true.
Frank, what about his responsibility? What about, where's the urgency about fixing the extent to which Russia is reaching in our society as we have this conversation? What has changed about this? Where's the enforcement?
Well, and if the president truly was thinking about public relations and spinning this properly and coming out as more credible than most people think he is, he would come out and announce a huge task force.
Hello? Anyone here?
With resources behind it to make
anyone
sure that
here?
this doesn't go another way.
Is dog got game?
2020 election. But I think Nicole hit it right on.
Anyone want to talk to me?
If he does that, he's trapped here. If he does that,
anyone?
In his mind, he somehow offers up the theory that my election was illegitimate. I delegitimize my selection of the American people if I even concede that Russia did something inappropriate here. So he feels trapped, when reality is he could come out and kind of be a very credible individual and say, look, this terrible thing has come out, and we're going to fix it. And actually, it would be a little bit of positive spin of this report to say, don't look at the obstruction part. Let's look at what Russia did. Let's coalesce together against a common adversary and get this fixed. Yet we don't see that happen.
Ari Melber, let's talk about what this is. We keep talking about terms of a mob movie. You're in a section right now where the president put a hit on Robert Mueller.
That's correct. This is central to what you think Donald Trump did or didn't do. I think we're going to bring this back up here. Yep. This is a key piece of evidence. Let me read from the Mueller report. Substantial evidence supports the conclusion that the president went further than their defense, and in fact, Mueller says, directed Don McGahn, his White House counsel, to call Rosenstein, who we know is Mueller's boss, to have the special counsel removed. That would be the firing of Bob Mueller. That's something that was reported in the Times. Here we see Mueller found it. First, McGahn's clear recollection was that the president directed him to tell Rosenstein not only that conflicts existed, but also that, quote, Mueller has to go. Let me repeat, Mueller has to go. This is the kind of evidence that may be of more interest to Congress than Attorney General Barr. This is the thing that everyone remembers from Nixon and the Saturday Night Massacre, because it actually happened. So when you remember what we heard this morning and what I think is going to be an issue going forward, Brian, did Donald Trump have the illicit intent to shut down the probe or not? This is the kind of evidence that obviously cuts against Donald Trump. The idea that he took overt acts to tell people, quote, according to the Mueller report, quote, Mueller has to go.
Don't move, because I need you to stick around to participate in the questioning of our next guest. We've been joined by Jay Sekulow, who is on the president's legal team. Counselor, thank you very much for joining us. Sure. My first question, I'm afraid, is going to verge on plain English. Where did the Attorney General get off with that characterization this morning, including 4 mentions that there was no collusion? What document was he reading compared to the one we're left with?
Well, page 2 of the document says the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. So it's right from the document itself.
Have you read part 1?
I have read part 1 and part 2.
You find good news in here for the president and the administration?
The investigation did not, page 181, the investigation did not establish that the contacts described in volume 1, that's the Russian contacts, amounted to an agreement to commit any violation of federal criminal law, including foreign influence and campaign finance laws. Yeah, I think it's a very good win.
Nicole Wallace.
Hi, Jay.
Hey, Nicole. Hey, Nicole. How are you? Good.
I'm not a fancy lawyer, so maybe we can switch over
You're very smart, though. Go ahead.
to normal people speak. I've read a lot of news accounts with your quotes about the rebuttal. Are you intending to rebut any part of the obstruction report that Robert Mueller released today?
Right now, we were prepared, and as you can imagine, as lawyers would be, for multiple scenarios here. Right now, we're responding to the media requests like you all did, like you all asked, and we're responding. Right now, we haven't decided whether we will need to release anything. My expectation is right now we don't.
Well, the entire obstruction report seems to be made up of terribly incriminating depictions of the president's conduct. I presume Don McGahn is someone you hold in high regard, Jay?
Well, let me tell you what.
Yes or no question, Jay. Is Don McGahn someone you hold in high regard?
I think. Look, I don't know Don McGahn that well. I know from his testimony. I'm sure Don's a fine person. Let me say this, okay? This is what it says. Page 78. Don McGahn ultimately did not quit, and the president did not follow up on the McGahn's request. Page.
Jay, I've got my own copy of the report. You're here because we're so lucky to get to talk to you. So I'd love to hear from you.
I'm not going to make personal. I'm not making personal commentary.
I'm not asking you to, but you're here to offer your analysis. Okay. Do you believe
my analysis is that the witnesses that testified, that the statements they made, when put through the lens that even the Department of Justice under Bob Mueller, when he was operating under his version of obstruction, did not rise to the level of obstruction. And what's interesting and important, Bill Barr said, even though they didn't agree with those theories of the case, they still looked at it through the lens that Bob Mueller had set forward and determined that there was no obstruction. And let's be honest here, and I know you are, Bob Mueller did not bring a case for obstruction because if he had one, he would have said there was obstruction and would have made that statement. He said there were difficult questions of law and fact. And when you have difficult questions of law and fact, you don't bring a case, and that's exactly what happened here.
I guess, Jay, I'm not challenging you on your read of the report, and obviously we all get to read the same words, but when we have your time, I would just love, you and Don McGahn, the conservative legal circle is not a wide ocean of people. We both know it's a pretty small universe, and you and Don McGahn were both in it. You both served Donald Trump. Don McGahn's testimony, as we see from the footnotes here, is devastating for your client, Donald Trump. He sought to have Jeff Sessions unrecuse himself. Another member, very small.
Okay, I'm not going to get into ad hominem attacks on anybody. What I'm going to say is this. Okay?
I'm asking you what your assessment is as the president's lawyer of the content as described here by witnesses like Don McGahn.
Yeah, my assessment is, Nicole, as is the assessment of the United States Department of Justice, including the Office of Legal Counsel, and ultimately Bob Mueller's, there was no obstruction.
Is that a high enough bar for the President of the United States, Jay? Well, that you didn't commit any criminal obstruction. Let's go back to work.
That's the legal standard that applies to situations like this under not only the guidelines that are set forth within the case law in the District of Columbia, also within the Justice Department manual.
As I said, fancy lawyer speak, but I'm asking you about the conduct that's described here. Does any of this were you prepared to have to defend your client from trying to fire Robert Mueller, which was obviously under scrutiny for many, many months, trying to get Jeff Sessions to unrecuse,
Robert Mueller completed his investigation and did his report and was not fired.
Ari Melber.
Jay, good afternoon to you. Ari Melber here. Thanks for joining us. Sure. And given that you represent the president, I would say, a legal matter, congratulations that there is some good news in the report for you, for your client.
Thanks.
Let me drill down on two important points we'd love to learn about from you. Number one, the White House counsel received this early copy of at least a redacted version of the report. If the report is fair and good for you, is it really appropriate for one side that was the subject of the probe to get that early version, and when did you receive it? And then number two, while there is good news, as I mentioned, Mr. Mueller makes very clear in this report that the Attorney General has released
Congress about their interaction with Russian-affiliated individuals and related. Those lies.
I'm stuck and can't move.
Russian election interference. Is your position that you accept that finding, and if so, does your client, the president, condemn Justice Department's
Let's go back. Let's do this in order. So restate your first question because your second one was pretty long. So give me your first question again so I can respond to that, and then I'll do number two.
The first question is, when did you receive the this report? And
so
is it appropriate for the White House to get an early copy before Congress?
Well, of course, the White House, I didn't receive it like as the White House would have, as the private counsel. So I want to be clear on that. So the White House would have received it, and I don't know the details of how they received it, within the it's interdepartmental. It's all Article 2. It's all within the executive. So that's how they would have received it.
I suppose I'm looking for a date for when you and they received it.
I don't know when they received it. I can tell you that we put in a request, I believe it was Thursday of last week, that since our client was the subject of the report, that we should be given an opportunity to review it, not to edit it, not to change it, not to redact it, to review it. And as Bill Barr said, under the practices under the Office of Government Ethics Act, we were allowed to see it. We reviewed it on Tuesday late afternoon and then Wednesday morning.
So you, as the lawyer for the president, received this on Tuesday with others?
Some on Tuesday, some on Wednesday, and it was with a team of lawyers.
And you don't see any appearance of impropriety given that your client is the potential subject of part of this, that
no, of course,
you received it before the Congress?
Precisely because of what you just said. Since our client was the subject of a lot of the discussion in the report, that's the practice under the Office of Government Ethics, as Bill Barr set forward, and you would see it before something.
We got you on the record on that. The other question was, Mueller finds these lies. I read you the quote. Do you accept that finding? And if so, does the president condemn those lies that interfered with his own Justice Department's investigation?
Look, I mean, I'm not. I know which ones I believe you're talking about. The president doesn't support anyone telling lies. So let's be crystal clear on that. In the course of this investigation, if people were under oath and made inconsistent statements or statements that were material, there's a standard that applies under false statement under 1001 of the 18 U.S.C., which is the criminal code. I'm trying not to be that technical, Nicole, but under the criminal code, there's a standard that applies. So that's what that is. No one supports anybody suborning perjury or talking about perjury or changing testimony.
It's interesting to learn from you when you received this, confirming on air Tuesday, as well as your discussions with our journalist, Brian Williams.
Tuesday and Wednesday, by the way. We were there Tuesday and Wednesday, to be clear. Yeah.
Understood. And so getting you on the record, as well as having the back and forth with Brian and Nicole and myself, on a big news day for your client, Jay Sekulow, attorney for the President of the United States. Thanks you for joining our coverage.
Thanks, Dean.
Thank you. All right, Ari, what have we learned?
Well, you heard the news there. A lot of debate over when we're going to get this report. I think everyone knows about that. Mr. Sekulow, and this is why interviewing people can always yield information, just confirmed on MSNBC that they had this report on Tuesday. Chairman Nadler said last night that he viewed this process as inappropriate and suspicious. It will be interesting and newsworthy, Brian, to hear other leaders like Chairman Nadler, who has oversight over the Justice Department, react to that as well, because the questions now are about if parts of the report are positive or fair to the White House, and we've been reporting out some of them that are, like what I just reported on Don Jr. Why such a suspicious rollout, and why a selective release? We'll see what other officials say about that.
Former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuade joins our happy family. Barbara, I just found something notable, page 158. Quote, the president's efforts to influence the investigation were mostly unsuccessful, but that's largely because the persons who surrounded the president declined to carry out orders or accede to his requests.
Yeah, so that's an interesting comment, because to obstruct justice, you do not need to succeed. It is simply the attempt to obstruct justice that is the crime. And so we are fortunate, I suppose, that there were those around him who had the courage to not be enablers in this instance, but that does not exonerate somebody from obstruction of justice. I think my takeaway from reading as much as I have, and it hasn't been all of the report, is that Robert Mueller was looking to make a traditional prosecutorial decision. Was a technical violation of a statute committed in a very narrow framework? But they also say that a sitting president cannot be indicted, cannot fit into that narrow framework. And so instead, I think what I would have expected is to share all this information with Congress, for Congress to decide whether high crimes and misdemeanors have been committed. And as I read this, I see a number of things that strike me as very unpresidential behavior. I mean, one is a big chunk of it is redacted, but relating to the coordination with WikiLeaks. You know, that page looks like this. But the coordination with WikiLeaks says that it does not technically rise to the level of a crime because, as we just saw in the Julian Assange case, where there was effort to hack into the computers and he was charged, because the Trump campaign was not involved in the hacking phase, then they could not legally be charged with the distribution phase. So that may not technically be a crime or DOJ policy to charge it that way, but if those facts suggest that the Trump campaign was involved in proactively staging and releasing those stolen emails, I think that's still very troubling and conduct unbecoming someone who becomes president, and one could argue has procured the presidency by fraud.
Yeah, Matt Miller, that's an interesting argument. They're saying that they are the customers, the recipients of this information. What would have to be proven to change that charge that somebody went in with a wrench in the back of a mainframe computer and went after stuff?
That they actually knew about the hack, that they cooperated in the hack, that they were somehow involved in the actual hack of documents.
Yeah,
not
go
just
get us.
And that applies to WikiLeaks as well. You saw when WikiLeaks was charged separately last week, it was for trying to hack into a government computer, not for the publishing of information. I picked up on the same thing Barbara did because I thought it relates to what the Attorney General said this morning. His wording around this section of what Bob Mueller found was very careful.
Yeah.
When he went through the kind of series of potential charges, he said they found no collusion with respect to the Internet Research Agency, the social media activity. They found no collusion, were his words, with respect to hacking.
Nope.
But then when he talked about the dissemination of information, he just said that a crime wasn't committed. He didn't say nothing happened, he said a crime wasn't committed. And so I was hoping that when we saw the report, that felt to me like he was spinning ahead of time what was in the report, and I was hoping when we found the report, we would see what the actual facts were.
Yeah, a lot of toner goes
All
to its
blacked out.
grave in
That
this
entire section is all blacked out. I
Yeah.
suspect that's because it relates to the ongoing Roger Stone case. And if so, that's something that the Justice Department said in a court filing yesterday they will show to Congress. So I'll be interested to see if members of Congress are allowed to see this material, and if their interpretation, they may agree with the Attorney General's and the Special Counsel's legal interpretation that no crime was committed, but I want to see if there's other information here about knowledge of the dissemination, either before or ongoing. There are references in the kind of narrative section of the summary to the very curious timing of the WikiLeaks dumps.
Nicole, Jay Sekulow plays in an amateur rock band in Washington. I presume there's not going to be backstage passes to Don McGahn for the next performance.
Listen, I wanted to say this about Don McGahn, or about Jay Sekulow. I appreciate that he called in. It's as Ari said, it's always valuable to hear what their take is on things, and I think he was a much more honest broker than William Barr. I mean, it was abundantly clear, and the only line of questioning I was trying to pursue with him was, where was your bar? Their bar was, my client escaped criminality. My client escaped criminality on conspiracy, and my client escaped by the hair of his chinny chin chin criminality on obstruction. That would have been a much more honest place for the Attorney General to start, quite frankly. And to see the inversion where the President's Defense Counsel gives a more honest take on the day. The headline today from Team Trump is he escaped criminality on the two prongs of the Mueller probe. Not what Barr did. And I just want to say, I laughed at the assertion from Jay Sekulow that the President doesn't want people to lie. This report is riddled with people who lie and efforts that Donald Trump made to get people.
You know Donald don't like you crying about the tablet.
He was saved by the integrity of the people around him.
It's all about getting people. The president's the entire obstruction investigation turns around efforts, successful and unsuccessful, of Donald Trump getting people to lie, and of Donald Trump seeking to get people to do things that were not within the scope of that which is legal, honorable, ethical, or really the work of the federal government. But the picture in here of Donald Trump's efforts to obstruct the investigation, not just obstruct it, obscure it, to get his entire national security apparatus to say he wasn't under investigation, is stunning. And it makes it, it's the why for Jay Sekulow's spin today being, we escaped criminality on the two central probes.
We have two people waving at their cameras. Give me a side-by-side here. We have Julia Ainsley and we have Ari Melber. Julia, you waved first, so do you, and then Ari.
Okay, So we're having a great conversation about obstruction, but there are some things on collusion that I think are worth pointing out, especially as we can expect Republicans in the Justice Department to be focusing on this idea of how this origins of the investigation started and whether or not they should have even opened up this investigation into possible coordination. There's a lot of smoke here, and there's three pieces I want to point out. First of all, Donald Trump Jr.'s contacts with WikiLeaks. He was contacted and asked if the campaign would disseminate a link that alleged that Hillary Clinton had ordered a drone strike against Julian Assange. He was asked if his father, the candidate at the time, could tweet a link, and he was also asked about a password to a website that had not yet launched. These were all communications between Donald Trump Jr. and WikiLeaks. Essentially, in the end, Robert Mueller decided that it wasn't clear that WikiLeaks had been hacked or was doing these hackings with the backing of Russia at the time. So he cleared him. But there's a lot of connections there. There are also connections with Jared Kushner going to that meeting in the Seychelles we talked about. There was an agreement there with Russians on this.
How to be a pro at PUBG. How to be a pro at me. What? How to be a pro? PUBG War. How to be a pro at me. Well, how to be a pro like me. What? I'm gonna be a pro like me. I said pro like me. Not those pros like you. What? Not those pros like you. What?
With Russians to get that dirt on Hillary Clinton. And from Michael Cohen's testimony to the special counsel, he said it seemed that the president or the candidate at the time already knew the outlines of what this meeting would be about. So I just want to point out all of that, how much smoke there was on collusion, and that this wasn't something that Mueller simply brushed aside. There are more details on these conversations that we've been reporting on for years now that are now coming to light and showing why there were concerns to open this investigation in the first place.
All right, Julia Ainsley, over to Ari Melber.
Brian, this really picks up, this is new reporting we have from the obstruction section. It picks up on the discussion that Nicole was having with the President's lawyer, Jay Sekulow, about Don McGahn. With your blessing, I'd like to read an extended portion.
Please
more than some of the other quotes, and I think this is going to give you a flavor of both what Mueller found, why these obstruction questions are close calls, and the environment. I'm about to read to you Mueller's account of Don McGahn talking about crazy S being his slang, his obscenity for what he was being asked to do, refused to do. I'm going to read at length, and part of this we're going to put on the screen, but let me read for context. McGahn tells Mueller he felt trapped because he didn't want to plan to follow Donald Trump's directive to fire Mueller, but he didn't know what to do the next time he would get pressure from President Trump. McGahn decides to resign. And this is the environment we're in this White House, with a very conservative, very loyal Republican White House counsel. He then has to call his personal lawyer. Mueller says, quote, he calls his personal lawyer and then his chief of staff. Then he drives to the White House and, quote, packs his belongings to submit his resignation letter, all to try to avoid being involved in what he thought might be a crime of obstructing and firing Mueller. McGahn spoke with the president, and he talks about that he understood this directive. And then McGahn says he's got to quit, as I was mentioning, because he decides that what this would be if he carried it out would be akin to the Saturday Night Massacre. That, of course, contributed to the end of the Nixon presidency. He calls his lawyer, as I mentioned. Now, I'm going to read on more of this. McGahn tells the president he called and demanded they contact the Department of Justice, and he avoids telling, this is very interesting, Brian, he avoids telling everyone exactly what Donald Trump asked him to do, which is evidence that McGahn viewed it as potentially criminal. And being an able lawyer, he did not want to spread that criminality around and involve other people, which gets to the crazy S. And people on the internet can say the word I won't. McGahn says the president asked him, according to Reince Priebus, to do crazy S. Rhymes with hit. But he thought McGahn, Priebus says, McGahn didn't tell me the specifics of Donald Trump's request because McGahn was trying to protect Priebus from what he did not, quote, need to know. Then, interestingly, Priebus and Bannon, Mueller finds, urged McGahn not to quit, and McGahn ultimately returned to work that Monday and remained as in position. He had not yet told the president himself directly that he planned to resign. Translation, Brian, in this section of the report, you see the potential hanging of a thread of the Trump presidency. And the lengths people went, as Nicole was discussing, Mr. McGahn being credible on these issues, to try to save the president from himself from what he called a potential Saturday Night Massacre. It is actually gripping prose.
Which is probably why the faint praise from Mr. Sekulow that I'm sure McGahn's a very nice person.
We know that Don McGahn spent at least 30 hours testifying before Robert Mueller. Once you start reading this, it's abundantly clear that it was likely more than that. I mean, he's on almost every page.
And he's a classically trained lawyer.
And he's a real Republican. And he was in there trying, you know, it would sound from Ari's analysis, trying to protect the president from himself. What I think history will determine is, was Don McGahn the difference between criminal obstruction or not? I mean, was Don McGahn both Robert Mueller? Did he serve masters? Was he basically informing Robert Mueller the entire time of all this conduct, as is clear from every footnote in the obstruction section, and laying his body on the tracks to sort of push Donald Trump away from some of these actions that almost certainly would have led to his impeachment, firing Mueller, getting Sessions to unrecuse. It's hard to imagine Trump being more brutal with Sessions, but it seems like McGahn nudged him just to the other side of complete abuse of his sitting attorney general. I think it will take a longer read and wider perspective to determine whether McGahn, in serving both Mueller and Trump, spared Trump from criminal obstruction.
Not Miller.
It wasn't just on McGahn. I'm reading through another section right next to that. The president was casting about the administration, and not just the administration, but his outside allies as well, looking for someone who would deliver messages to the Justice Department. He enlisted at one point Corey Lewandowski, his former campaign manager, to go and meet with the Attorney General to deliver a message that the Attorney General needed to give a speech saying that there shouldn't be a special counsel. I know the president didn't do anything wrong, and if Jeff Sessions would do it, he should deliver a message that he's fired. That's his former campaign manager who doesn't even serve in the government to deliver that message.
I think it was over the 4th of July.
That's right. Lewandowski wanted to have the meeting, set it up. It had to be canceled for some reason. Lewandowski then tried to find someone inside the administration, Rick Dearborn, who was close to the Attorney General. And Rick Dearborn, like Don McGahn, had the good sense to say, I'm not going to do that. Told Corey Lewandowski he'd done it, but didn't do it. An example of someone close to the president deciding, either because they wanted to protect the president or they wanted to protect themselves from criminal liability, not to carry out a very, very troubling order.
Joyce Vance, what have you found?
You know, as we read through this voluminous information and as I listen to the conversations that you all are having in New York, I'm reminded of one of the first conversations that Ari Melber and I ever had about this when the investigation was young. And we
last one
talked
was
about
with
the fact
Papa.
that there was some conduct
He
that was not illegal,
he couldn't find the lollipop.
but that was still inappropriate for a president. We talked about the notion that there was conduct that was lawful but awful. And to the extent
What color is
that's
it?
what Bob Mueller's report tells us today. There is so
This
much
one's mine.
conduct by this president, whether it's the obstruction conduct, whether it's the blind eye that he turned.
This
to
one's
offers
mine.
Russian help, that one is left with the conclusion that this president simply has failed to uphold the oath of office that he took on that inauguration day, when he said that he would faithfully execute and that he would take care to ensure that the laws of the United States were upheld. It is very difficult to see how this report does not end up on Capitol Hill and provide a powerful roadmap for what comes next.
Let me ask you this. What report do you think the Attorney General was describing this morning?
Not the one that I'm reading now. Funny that you should say that. And when you and I first talked this morning, we talked about how Barr had strongly presented that the White House had fully cooperated with the investigation. And there's a place early on in this report, I think it's on page 10 or thereabouts, where Mueller says there were a lot of impediments to a full investigation here. And one he identifies is the fact that so many key witnesses lied to him repeatedly in the course of investigating. And he then notes that it might be that the outcome of this report could be different, that the evidence, the information he was unable to obtain could shed new light on the investigation or could present some of its events in a completely different light. That, I think, is fairly chilling.
Joyce Vance will continue reading to Nicole Wallace.
I think we're joined now by Congressman Eric Swalwell. Congressman, your initial thoughts and reaction to what you're reading for the very first time from Robert Mueller's 22-month investigation.
Well, good afternoon, Nicole and Brian. Well, first, I hope once and for all the President of the United States will acknowledge that Russia attacked us. And when you read through the multiplicity of contacts that are laid out of Russians in the Trump campaign, Russians in the transition team, Russians and the administration, it's clear that our democracy has been compromised, and this president needs to acknowledge that. Otherwise, we won't do anything to protect this from happening again.
Yes, give me a
Second,
minute.
Nicole, the investigation lays out that the Trump team, the president himself, lied and obstructed in ways that impaired in a material fashion the investigation. So just because you may bury the evidence deep enough that we can't find everything you did, we have recourse in the United States, which is obstruction of justice. And this president is a double-digit obstructor, according to the Mueller report, in the number of ways he sought to obstruct. Which leads me, Nicole, to Attorney
Come
General.
on.
You can be the
I
Attorney
shouldn't have said come
General
on.
of the United States and represent all of us, or you
Come
can
on.
represent Donald Trump. You can't do both. And because Attorney General Barr wants to represent Donald Trump, I think he should resign.
You're calling for the Attorney General's resignation today after what you saw?
He's lost the credibility of the American people. He is not recused from an investigation where he should be recused. He's embedded deeply into the Trump team, and that affects the credibility that the Attorney General must have.
He certainly wants us to think he sounds like that's the case. I want to read you something that's in the special counsel report about your responsibilities, the responsibility of Congress. Special counsel writes, although the president has broad authority under Article 2, that authority coexists with Congress's Article 1 power to enact laws that protect congressional proceedings, federal investigations, the courts, and grand juries against corrupt efforts to undermine functions. Usually those constitutional powers function in harmony with the president in courting the criminal laws under Article 2 to protect against corrupt obstructive acts. But when the president's official actions come into conflict with the prohibitions in the obstruction statutes, any congressional tension is reconciled through separation of power analysis. Do you hear that as a call to duty to commence impeachment proceedings, something Nancy Pelosi has said is off the table?
Well, our investigation has already begun, Nicole, and we have a meeting this afternoon on the Judiciary Committee, and we are first seeking to bring Bob Mueller in to testify to the full report, because we paid for this report. We should see all of it, including what's redacted, as long as it doesn't affect anything ongoing. But second, Nicole, aside from the investigation and looking backward, we also now have to have the imagination to put into law prohibition against so much of the conduct that the president and his team did. Just because Congress in the past didn't have an imagination to prohibit a campaign from working in such a fashion with the Russians doesn't mean we shouldn't put in place new laws to protect our democracy from any campaign doing that in the future. I think making this about the future is the best way for us to go forward.
Just really quick, last question. Does the future include commencing impeachment proceedings based on what you're reading in the Mueller report?
Need some new guns.
So I'm going to leave that
Can't
to
beat these
Chairman
zombies
Adler.
with-
Again, he's leading a meeting today. There are
Barely
concerning
any ammo.
contacts that the campaign had with the Russians, and the way that the president lied, he certainly acted guilty, and there are consequences for the way that he and the people on his team acted.
Congressman Eric Swalwell, always a pleasure to get to chat with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole.
To Frank Figluzzi, who has zeroed in on an exchange between Manafort and his deputy Gates.
Yeah, I want to follow up, Brian, on something that Joyce Vance mentioned, which was, again, this theme that it may not be criminal, but it may not be acceptable conduct by our president and the people around him. And I look at page 123, and it says, in January 2018, Manafort told Gates that he had talked to the president's personal counsel, and they were, quote, going to take care of us. Manafort told Gates it was stupid to plead, saying that he had been in touch with the president's personal counsel and repeating that they should, quote, sit tight and, quote, will be taken care of. Gates asked Manafort outright if anyone mentioned pardons, and Manafort said no one used that word. And we're back to that kind of mob boss, the inability to nail this down because the mob boss isn't saying the magic words, and his counsel's not saying, I'm going to pardon you, we're going to pardon you, but rather, you'll be taken care of. So American people in Congress need to decide whether this is what we want from our president, whether, in fact, dangling pardons, promising that you'll be taken care of is acceptable conduct. And then I want to just follow up on the congressman's statements about Barr and where we are with him. If I'm Christopher Wray right now, the current director of the FBI, and I'm interacting every day with this Attorney General, I need to ask myself, will he have my back when I present him sensitive corruption cases? And Brian, on any given day, the FBI is operating hundreds of public corruption cases at all levels across the country. If I share that with the Attorney General in my daily briefing, can I trust that that's not going to the White House or not going to the public target of a corruption investigation? And some questions need to be asked about whether there's continued effectiveness possible from this Attorney General.
Also, I'm sitting here reading about the president's public statements during the Manafort trial, Frank, speaking of stuff out of a movie, including during jury deliberations, had the potential to influence the trial jury. Quote, the potential to influence jurors who learned of the statements which the president made just as jurors were considering whether to convict or acquit Manafort. That's a screenplay.
The timing of this, the public, we're watching obstruction and tampering take place in plain view as this plays out, is again, in my opinion, evidence of criminality. We understand that the Attorney General took that call as his own and made the call, but there's increasing reasons and the increasing basis in this report to have Congress say, we've got to take this on ourselves at this point.
Barrett Berger, formerly of the Eastern and Southern Districts of New York. Barrett, I understand you and I have been reading apparently the same section, which is about the fact that Mueller is limited to the president's written responses. It's been surmised publicly and rather directly that this wasn't the president up late at night in the residence with a legal pad, carefully writing out his responses. Customarily, these are your attorneys writing what you want to say. And there's a little bit of a powerlessness in the remarks in the Mueller report here, in that they were limited just to that, and they couldn't ascertain more because there was no interview.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that's a great word, the powerlessness. And if you look at the report, the special counsel's office says multiple times that the written answers were inadequate, were insufficient, that they didn't feel that they got a full accounting of what the president knew for this. But they also say pretty clearly that they weighed this possibility of whether they should, go forward with a subpoena of the president, but they ultimately decided that it wasn't worth the delay that would inevitably cause to the investigation. In fact, they point to the written answers, and they say that there are 30 instances where the president says he doesn't recall or doesn't remember. That's certainly the work of lawyers there, and it's scripted, and to me it is just disheartening that the special counsel's office had to conclude their investigation without getting satisfactory answers from the president on these pretty basic questions. And more importantly, it really goes in direct contradiction with what Barr said this morning about how the White House was fully cooperating with this investigation. I just don't know how you call this full cooperation when the special counsel's office is left saying that the written responses were insufficient.
That is a great point in summation. Barbara McQuaid has been reading her portions, and Barbara, I understand you have a reminder for us that this, at the end of the day, is about Russia.
Yeah, to me, that's the part I've been focusing on, is what was Russia up to and what was the Trump campaign up to try to interfere with our election. And a couple of things that were not previously known that I think are really important. One is Konstantin Kilimnik, the person to whom Paul Manafort gave that polling data that we talked about earlier. The special counsel supports the FBI's assessment that he was affiliated with Russian intelligence. They say that based on their witness interviews and emails obtained through court-ordered search warrants, they have concluded that the FBI's assessment is correct, that he was a member of Russian intelligence. And so what does that say? Again, even if we can't make the link that a conspiracy was committed here as a matter of law, that we have the Trump campaign sharing polling data with Russian intelligence. I think that's something that Congress needs to consider very seriously. And then, in addition, the report also says that when he asked Russia to find Hillary Clinton's 30,000 emails, he didn't just make that statement to the public. He actually said it repeatedly. Michael Flynn said he requested it repeatedly of staff, and that Michael Flynn himself reached out to Peter Smith, the now deceased Republican operative that we've heard about, who set up a company and was hiring security experts to try to obtain all of these emails so that they could be weaponized and used against her. And so, but for incompetence, perhaps, President Trump would have committed the crime of conspiracy.
So back up, it wasn't just in response to Katie Tur's question in public that the president said, in effect, Russia, if you're able to find those 30,000 emails.
Yes, according to the report, page 62 of Volume 1, it says that Trump asked individuals